Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Liberty Hangout podcast. We all hope you had a very Merry Christmas. Before we start the show, I just have a quick announcement for our listeners. We are proud to announce that the Liberty Hangout podcast is now available on iTunes, so make sure you go ahead and subscribe to the show. Tonight, we have the joy of hosting a four-time New York Times best-selling author. He's also a professor of history at Western Connecticut State University and is a world-renowned constitutional scholar and historian. Ladies and gentlemen, I am proud to introduce to you Dr. Kevin Gutzman. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Kevin. It's a pleasure to have you on.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
So about a year ago, I read your book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, and I learned something that truly fascinated me, that there is no such nation called the United States of America, and that each state is supposed to be its own sovereign nation. Can you explain to our listeners the difference between federalism and nationalism?
Well, sure. A federal system is one in which first you have the constituent parts, and they create a federal government with limited authority delegated from the parts because the parts are unable to fulfill particular government functions for themselves. So, for example, Australia, a little over 100 years ago, was 6 separate colonies, and they decided it made more sense to have a common military effort and a common monetary union and various other common functions, and so they created the Union of Australia. Similarly, Switzerland is composed of several different cantons which have a strong degree of local self-government. They have a common defense policy and a common monetary policy, and also the United States was formed on the same kind of federal model. On the other hand, a national government is one where, or a national system is one in which the center came first, so there's one unitary entity, and it might have local administrative subdivisions, but those exist only for the convenience of the center. So the classic example of that kind of system is the one that was created by the revolutionaries in France in the 1780s. They essentially took the medieval administrative regional map of France and etch-a-sketched it, and then redrew more or less equally large administrative subdivisions whose purpose is to fulfill the legislative mandates of the national government. So in one case, the federal case, the power comes up from the local administrative units, and in the other case, the national, the power goes down from the unitary central national system.
And Professor Gutzman, it's James Chillemi here. Hello. For our followers that know you, I think you are a world-renowned historian, especially on the founders and the framers, especially Thomas Jefferson. Now, during his pre- and post-presidential years, Thomas Jefferson is always likened to the localist, decentralist, and libertarian traditions. What do you make of the legacy of Jefferson, and where in line of American libertarian intellectuals should he rank?
Oh, well, he's central to the decentralist or federal tradition in the United States. He's one who started before the Revolution arguing that the British government had only some few powers. Those were the powers that the local units of the British Empire could not exercise for themselves. So, for example, the Bahamas or Hanover or Connecticut couldn't defend itself, and therefore he said that it makes some sense to have a common military policy, for example, a common diplomatic effort. On the other hand, his argument was that the British Parliament, despite its own pretensions to being the national legislature of the British Empire, really only rightly exercised the powers of local government in the British Isles, and all other powers, all other legislative powers in the British Empire were to be exercised by the provincial legislatures, meaning the General Assembly in Massachusetts or Virginia, the House of Commons in New York, and so on. This vision of the colonies and other administrative or other local units of the British Empire as essentially self-governing and tied together only by their common fealty to the House of Hanover didn't really change much after independence for him. He substituted a union government for the House of Hanover, but he still thought that first the Continental Congress, later the Confederation Congress, finally the federal government had only those few powers that had been delegated to them by the still sovereign states. And from 1774, when he first made this argument, all the way to 1825, when he last touched on it. Of course, he died in mid-1826. He had essentially the same position. Even when he was vice president, for example, in 1797, he argued that grand jurors who had met in Richmond, federal grand jurors who had met in Richmond and indicted a Virginia congressman for things he had said in a mailing to his constituents, those grand jurors, he said, should be tried for treason against Virginia, because they had purported to exercise power that Virginia had not granted to the central government in a way that was going to deprive Virginians of their traditional rights. And so Vice President of the United States thought that federal grand jurors should be indicted by Virginia for treason against Virginia. This position, of course, is reflected in the entire tradition of state rights or strict construction or localist or libertarian or whatever you want to call it. A Jeffersonian is what I usually call it. Constitutionalism in American history from, as I say, before the Revolution down to the present.
Now, I'm currently in the middle of reading your book, James Madison and the Making of America. Now,
good idea.
I'm only about a third of the way into it, but I still can't discern what Madison actually valued most, freedom or control. Now, I find it interesting that he fought ardently to actually preserve the freedom of religion, yet at the same time, he admitted in his own words that he wanted to grow the federal government for the purpose of coercion. Now, without giving away too much of your book, what do you make of the legacy of Madison, and is he a figure in American history that should be revered or abhorred?
Well, as to that last, I think neither. He's somebody who thought that it was only possible to have a free society if you had the appropriate degree of government. And actually, he and Jefferson agreed about this in the abstract. Jefferson happened to be in France in the 1780s when these questions came to a head in Madison's mind, and so was not part of the argument over the extent to which the Confederation ought to be strengthened after the Revolution. There was a consensus after the Revolution, including in the minds of people like Sam Adams and Patrick Henry, whom we generally consider as advocates of the idea of a very limited central government, that the Confederation government was just too weak. It couldn't tax at all. It couldn't raise an army at all. It was more or less like the United Nations. Basically, it was a place where people sent by the states met, talked about what their policies ought to be, and then could only go back to the states and say, here's what we think our policies ought to be. Madison's argument was, well, the Congress ought to be an actual government. It ought to be able to tax people for limited purposes. It ought to be able to adopt legislation in limited areas or in enumerated areas to adopt federal policies. This is not inconsistent with what I was saying earlier about the idea of a federal government. Madison, although in the Philadelphia Convention he argued for a national government, his argument was defeated in Philadelphia, and ever after he said that the new federal government was federal, that the Congress only had enumerated powers, that the courts only had enumerated types of jurisdiction, that the rights that were recognized by the amendments, the first few amendments, were sacrosanct, and so on. So I think Madison was more concerned with the practicalities of these questions, and Jefferson was more concerned with the big picture. And, of course, the big picture is the one we find more appealing. But Jefferson certainly always thought that he and Madison were close colleagues in these questions, although people like me who study them can see that there were some significant distinctions between their political philosophies. They generally ended up with the same practical proposals and the same practical policies.
Now, I'm really glad you brought up the Articles of Confederation. Could you give our listeners a more attuned synopsis of the main plans of the Articles of Confederation, the New Jersey plan of the Constitution, and the Virginia plan of the Constitution, and also explain, had you been at the Convention of '87, what you would have supported and why?
Well, that's easy. Okay, the Articles of Confederation, of course, are the first federal constitution. In fact, in the Philadelphia Convention, Numerous delegates, including on more than one occasion Madison, referred to the Articles of Confederation as, quote, our federal constitution. So nowadays you hear people like Straussians or other nationalists say, well, the current constitution is obviously supposed to have created a national government because it's called a constitution. And that's what a constitution does. That's different from the Articles of Confederation, which weren't a constitution. But the problem they have with that is that people like Madison called it the federal constitution. That is, the Articles of Confederation were a federal constitution. However, as I alluded to before, they created a central government with extremely limited power. That is, even though the Articles of Confederation were created during the Revolution, they didn't give Congress power to raise an army. They didn't give Congress power to tax anybody. And what this meant was that American ambassadors in Europe ended up showing, for example, John Jay was sent to Spain to be the American minister there, which now we call ambassador. And the first thing he had to do was ask the foreign minister of Spain to loan him money so he could rent a house and buy some food. I mean, this was obvious. I'm not exaggerating. So obviously this was an untenable situation for the American government to be in. And actually, Jay stayed over a year at the Spanish court without ever meeting the king, without ever actually making any progress. So people like Madison thought that the government should be strengthened, and this is the chief reason why the Philadelphia Convention was held. And so in Philadelphia, you end up with multiple proposals of the kind of government there ought to be. The first from Madison and his fellow Virginia delegates, which is usually called the Virginia Plan, looked to a national government with a general legislative authority, with Congress able to veto over all state laws, with people in both houses of Congress representing the population of the states rather than the state legislators as before, and with also a judiciary that had jurisdiction over basically all significant questions. This idea, this proposal, was supported by people from the large states. You can see why they'd support population apportionment in a very strong central government they were going to control. But New York was an exception to that, and in general the small states opposed this. And so ultimately their counter-proposal was what's called the New Jersey Plan, which looked to something that was very similar to the Articles of Confederation. Apparently the main reason why the New Jersey Plan was proposed was that the small states wanted a negotiating position to keep state apportionment instead of population apportionment. That is, to keep an equal vote for the states. So ultimately, of course, you had a kind of compromise in which the people who were from the large states got population apportionment in the lower house of Congress. People from the small states got state equality in the upper house of Congress. But what people usually don't recognize is the large state delegates lost on basically every other question. They didn't get a general power for Congress. They didn't get a congressional veto over all state laws. They didn't get state legislators out of the business of electing members of Congress, because down to 1913, state legislators were still empowered to choose senators and so on. So this was a federal document. They enumerated types of jurisdiction that the federal courts would have. They enumerated legislative powers that the Congress would have. This was a federal document. And, well, what would I have favored? I don't know. I think, in general, the chief problem in our government today is that the federal government has come to have unlimited legislative authority. But whether you could say that this is the fault of the people who drafted the Constitution or of its early amenders, or you would want to say that it is actually the fault of more recent generations who have essentially decided they wanted unlimited government, I don't think is a hard question. No matter what the Constitution said, today's electorate and today's elected officials and appointed officials want unlimited government, and so they would say they have unlimited government. And in fact, the judicial decisions, the judicial opinions giving us unlimited government have mostly been fatuous. I mean, they've just been completely unmoored from the language of the Constitution, you know. So I like to tell people, well, if the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment hadn't empowered the federal courts to strike down state criminal punishments they disliked and order kids to ride buses for thousands of hours in a lifetime to achieve racial balance, and and give us the most liberal abortion laws in the world, and declare that homosexual unions are marriage and so on. If we didn't have the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, the same judges would have reached the same conclusions by pointing to the fact that Article 1 says U.S. reps have to be at least 25 years old. I mean, that is no less connected to those outcomes than the Due Process Clause is. So it's really a matter of contemporary opinion that we ended up with this kind of government. It's actually not because the Constitution wasn't drafted to create a federal instead of a national system.
I think that you, for the most part, answered most of my next question.
Oh, good.
When reading the Articles of Confederation, it can seem a little confusing to actually understand what powers were delegated to the federal government of the time. And of course, in your average public school, we're often taught about the Articles from a biased perspective. So would you be able to go and detail some of the specifics of the Articles of Confederation, and also what differences besides the size of the government can be drawn from this versus the Constitution? So, for example, how were the representatives elected, or what types of checks and balances were there? As well, how did the courts work?
Well, yes, it's true that the version of these things you get is presented from a particular biased perspective. It's actually taken for granted by textbooks, virtually all textbooks for high school students, that the Articles have been a failure. They had to be replaced. They couldn't just have been amended. The U.S. Constitution, in fact, some prominent American religious traditions say that the U.S. Constitution was divinely inspired, which I think would have shocked people like Ben Franklin and Gouverneur Morris, who are two of the chief authors. And if they did anything because of divine inspiration, I would like to know what it was exactly. I can tell you a few stories about Morris when we have a G-rated venue sometime. Anyway, the powers of the Confederation government were very few. Essentially, it said that the government would be able to make a military policy, would be able to make diplomatic policy, would be able to make land policy in regard to relations with the Indians and so on. But although it could make these policies, the only way it could get money was by asking the state legislators for it. So say, for example, George Washington told, or the same was true for soldiers for the Army. So say that George Washington wrote a letter to the President of Congress and said, I believe I need 13,000 more soldiers for the next 6 months, or I'm going to need $150,000 to pay my soldiers for the next 3 weeks. The only way that the Congress could get that money was to take that number, 150,000, divide it by 13, send the 13 letters to the 13 state capitals and say, your share of 150,000 is X, and then hope that in Williamsburg and Albany and Boston and Hartford and so on, legislators met and hurriedly sent the money. Basically, they didn't do it, and so every state sometimes sent its money late. By the time the Confederation ceased to exist in 1789, some states were sending money never. Every state sometimes sent less than had been requested, both of men and of money, and this wasn't a government at all. Madison's term for this was the imbecility of the government. But nowadays, imbecility means extreme stupidity, and in those days it actually referred to what we would now call mental retardation. But another thing it could mean was that something was just enervated. In other words, it had no energy at all. It couldn't do anything. So Madison referred to the imbecility of the Confederation government. It could not do anything. It could not tell anybody to do anything. It could not provide, again, food for John Jay, who's the American minister to Spain. He's basically a beggar at Valladolid, right? He basically had no support from the government at all. And well, was this the way it was supposed to work? No. I suppose the expectation of John Dickinson when he was the chief author of the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation, was that people in in state capitals in Delaware and North Carolina and Georgia and so on would hurriedly send the money that was requested by the government because they wanted to fund the war, and it didn't turn out to work that way.
Just as a follow-up to that, would you say that the federal government under the Articles fits well with our libertarian ideals, seeing as it operated on a voluntary basis?
I don't know. I suppose if you want to say having no government is consistent with being a libertarian, I mean, the question is a libertarian an anarchist? If you want to say a totally ineffective and ineffectual constitution gives you an anarchist situation, sure. But do you really want that when the British Army is camped out 3 miles down the road? Would you like to have somebody paying cavalrymen to go fight those British to get them out of your county? Myself, I don't go that far. Like Ron Paul, who recently was asked by Tom Woods, "Are you an anarchist?" and responded by saying, "Well, I don't know how an anarchist police force or court or army would work. I don't believe it can." That's kind of my position. I think I'm a Jeffersonian. I think there should be a limited amount of government, but there are some functions I have not seen in historical study ever operating in an anarchist setting, and certainly that's true of getting royal hussars out of your state. So I don't have anything to say for the unamended Articles of Confederation. Now, it's an interesting question whether, as people like Richard Henry Lee and George Mason and Jefferson argued, you could have just kept the Articles of Confederation and made a few amendments to it, to that document. I think actually that was probably something that could have been done. But by the time the Philadelphia Convention met in 1787, since people who wanted to do that or would have been willing to do that had not been actively trying to change the articles so that they would be effectual, it was the nationalists who managed to convene the convention that wrote the Constitution. So we ended up with 3 powerful branches of government and so on.
Now, can you go a little bit more into the powers of the president under the Articles?
There was no president under the Articles. There was an official who was called the President of the United States, and he was more or less what we would now call the Speaker of the House. So because he was the Speaker of the Congress, he's the one who conducted the United States government's correspondence with, say, the King of France. But he was nothing like the world colossus we think of now when we hear the term President of the United States. He wasn't He wasn't somebody who could decide, well, I don't like the ruler of Haiti. I'm gonna warn him that if he doesn't resign his office, I'm gonna put a missile through his window. Which actually Colin Powell told the dictator of Haiti that in the 1990s. He wasn't somebody who would have been able to say, I want a particular Korean ruling in South Korea, or I want a particular Arab ruling in Mesopotamia. There was nothing like that at all. He was just a kind of speaker with administrative duties because there was no one else to do this. Congress actually appointed somebody they called the Secretary for Foreign Affairs. He answered to the Congress in theory, but in practice, because Congress was only sometimes in session, he usually was answering to the Speaker, the so-called President. So this is, again, totally unlike today's President, who even constitutionally has a completely separate office and a role in legislation and so on.
Now, going back to your point before about anarchy versus Jeffersonianism, I think that there's a great deal of literature written on anarcho-capitalism and how police, military, and courts work in an anarchic society.
Right. And of course, as a historian, I have to hurry and add that it's entirely theoretical. That is, do you want to try this theory? The town where my university is located is Danbury, Connecticut. The British Army burned down Danbury, Connecticut during the Revolution, and people in Connecticut were happy to have the actual Continental Army show up and drive the British out of Connecticut. And so now there were, of course, militia units during the Revolution, but people don't usually recognize that these were actually organized by the state governments. They weren't self-generated anarchist institutions.
Right, and Justin and I both subscribe to the Tom Woods idea that if we were under a Jeffersonian regime, I think we'd be, happy as a clam. And right. I think that is one of the main ways.
Well, that's my idea too.
Exactly, and I think that one of the ways in which we're going to move towards a more free society is by taking the political steps as a major way to do that. But going back, talking more about the founders, when you refer to the founders of the Constitution, especially in modern academia, the faces of Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, Jay, Mason, Washington, Franklin, they usually pop up into people's heads. However, very seldom spoke about are the legacies of Gouverneur Morris, Luther Martin, John Lansing, William Patterson. What do you think certain members of the convention were enshrined in people's minds and others were consigned to oblivion?
Well, partly it's about holding high federal office later, of course. People who are president or secretary of state, or those people tend to be famous. There are other people who were elevated into more eminent places in our memory because subsequent politicians found something they had said or something they had written to be useful in contemporary terms. So we end up with various monuments here and there to some of these people and not to others. There's a kind of randomness to it too. It's not obvious why one or the other would be popular, but in general, you can say that if you opposed ratification of the Constitution, no matter how prominent you had been in the Revolution, you're not going to be remembered as well as if you had favored it. And of course, Ben Franklin isn't as well remembered as some of these others because he was, at the point of death when the federal government was instituted. So he never played a prominent role in that. Anyway, that's my answer.
Thank you.
Sure.
Now, in reading your book about Madison, I find it fascinating that after the passage of the Articles of Confederation, the states weren't very fond of Madison's idea to actually hold another constitutional convention, and that they were in fact so turned off by this idea that Maryland didn't even send a delegate to a convention that they hosted. Now, considering how little support Madison had to draft a new constitution, what was able to finally convince the states that it was in their best interest to cede some of their powers and create a brand new federal government?
Well, you're assuming that the states made that decision. And actually, the delegates who were sent to the Philadelphia Convention were sent with instructions to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation. So that was actually the stated purpose of the Philadelphia Convention of 1787 that ended up writing the U.S. Constitution. Several states' delegates had commissions that said their function was to join with delegates from other states in proposing amendments to the Articles of Confederation. Congress, in issuing its call for the Philadelphia Convention, had said the same thing, that it wanted a convention to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation. And in fact, several delegates left the convention early because they said, this activity you're involved in here of drafting a new national government's constitution is not what we're supposed to do. We can't be involved in this. So early in the summer of 1787, two of the three delegates from New York, for example, left, and they never returned. That meant that through most of the Philadelphia Convention, only 11 states were represented. That's Rhode Island never having sent anybody, and the New York delegates, except for Hamilton, having left. Hamilton actually was absent for most of the summer of 1787 too. He apparently decided, well, if I don't get to vote, there's no reason being here. People know what I think. So he was elsewhere.
Now,
but one more thing. The reason why people who wanted change to the Constitution from the Articles to something more centralized, something stronger, was that they had just decided this government, as it stands, can't perform the bare functions of a federal government. It can't, again, raise an army, feed the troops. People don't remember, but it was notorious at the time. There were many men who actually froze to death, starved to death, went into battle without weapons in their hands during the Revolution. So George Washington at some points was down to only 4,000 or 5,000 soldiers. It's kind of hard to imagine. I think I could raise more people than that to watch a local high school football game. So this seemed to people something that was just intolerable. Clearly, the United States would not be able to win the war, or if it did, remain an independent country, if it didn't have an actual government. Not that it had to have a monstrously enormous government. Certainly, people like Madison did not want that, but it should be a government that didn't rely on state legislators for its own funding.
that's a great point. And I think, moving on, University of Rochester professor William H. Riker, he often delves into what we call social science fiction. And he posits what he believes would have happened if the convention would have broken up. Now, if Elbridge Gerry had instead voted no for the report of the Committee of 11 and Massachusetts' vote would have been discounted, he claims that North America would look akin to South America. There would be small, industrial, agrarian, possibly slave-owning regional federations. But he also laments that America would not have participated in any of the world wars. Now, what do you think would have happened in the event that the convention would have disbanded and for the time being the Articles would have continued their authority?
Well, people did talk about this. One thing that proponents of changing the Articles of Confederation predicted was that in case the Confederation weren't strengthened, there likely would be 3 separate regional confederations. Whether that's true is hard to say. I think that there was a patriotic sense of a common identity after the Revolution, and so it's somewhat hard for me to concede this point. I tend to see it as nationalist propaganda. You better do this or something terrible will happen. This is a common lawyer's trick, of course. I think it's hard to say what the result would have been. It obviously might have resulted in amendment to the Articles of Confederation. There was essentially a consensus that the Articles needed to be changed. Even, again, people like Sam Adams and Patrick Henry thought the central government was too weak. But their answer was just to give the central government power to raise a tariff. If you want to have the federal government fund its few functions, well, just give it this taxing power. That's all you need to do. Keep the same distribution of authority between the central and state governments, except allow the central government to fund the few functions it's supposed to perform itself, instead of asking people in Rhode Island, do you want to send money, and having them say, well, no. Or, well, we'd rather send less than you're asking for.
Now, going back to your book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, I recall reading that because Rhode Island and North Carolina did not immediately sign the Constitution, they remained their own separate union, even early into George Washington's presidency in the case of Rhode Island.
They weren't a separate union. They were states that were outside the Confederation, or the new federal union at that point.
Okay, so then that answers my question then, because I was going to ask if they were governed by a separate federal government.
No.
Okay, secondly then, that answers my question there, but then also, what does this then say about the legal argument for secession if having a state enter into the Union was a voluntary act?
Well, I have just completed a manuscript of a new book about Jefferson, in which the longest chapter is the one about his understanding of the federal relationship. And if you were unpersuaded before, you're going to be persuaded now that the states never conceded or never ceded to the federal government control over their union. That is, it was understood when the Constitution was made and for decades thereafter that the states could withdraw if they wanted to. In fact, in Virginia, one of the chief Federalist delegates, one of the 3 leading Federalist orators in Virginia's ratification convention, told the ratification convention in the very last major speech before they voted on whether to ratify the Constitution, well, we're going to be one of 13 parties to a compact, and because we're party to a compact, what we tell the other states we understand the Constitution to mean is going to be binding on them, and if we find that the powers we're giving to this new government are being abused, we can reclaim them. Now, another way of saying we can reclaim the powers we're granting to this new government is that we can secede. We could pull out of the Union. We could take back power of this new government to exercise its authority within Virginia. And there was no contradiction of this. As I said, he was a Federalist. The only argument, really, this is true in all the states, the argument about the Constitution was not between people who said the government ought to be national and the government ought to be federal. The argument was about this question: is this new government federal? Federalists said it was. Nationalists said, well, we wish it were, but it's not. Nobody was advocating a national government. So I think this is actually a pretty easy question.
Now, making the transition, and perfectly so, talking about federalism, for my undergrad politics degree, I was required to read the Federalist Papers. And throughout the work, the large republic is consistently favored over the small locality. Now, in Federalist 10, as you might recall, Madison argued that the large Republican representatives' enlightened views and virtuous sentiments render them superior to local prejudices and to schemes of injustice. And then again in Federal 46, Madison claims that the interests of nations have, quote, suffered on 100 occasions from an undue attention to local prejudices, interests, and views of the particular states, end quote. How would a student of history of the 21st century best respond to these claims?
Well, of course, you have to remember that when he's referring to the national interest, he's talking about only the very few powers that's currently over my head, or how many gallons of water are in my toilet bowl, or what time, what kind of bus will come to take my kids to school, or what curriculum they'll have in the building that's 2 miles from where I'm sitting, but 400 miles from Washington, D.C. These issues, nobody doubted, were to be left to the local government, were to be left to the state legislatures. By the way, you should remember, it was government by the state legislatures that people fought for in the Revolution. That was the issue. No taxation without representation was not only about taxes, it was about government generally. So the question was, are we to be governed by a government in Britain where people don't know us at all, where basically none of the members have ever been to any of these colonies in North America, or should we be governed by people we've elected in our provincial assemblies? And in all 13 states, people said, well, we want to be governed by our provincial assemblies. This insistence on government by provincial assemblies did not vanish between the beginning of fighting at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775 and the drafting of the U.S. Constitution 12 years later in Philadelphia. But people didn't think, Madison wasn't saying every single question of governance ought to be decided by some few people in a federal capital, in a national capital. That was not his point. His point was, if we're going to have a common military policy, if we're going to have a common policy about overseas trade, if we're going to have a common policy about American relations with the Indians, these things ought to be decided by the central government because they're national issues. They're issues we all have in common. Now, you can distort that quotation by taking it out of context, reading it as if you didn't know anything about the background or what Madison was actually talking about, and treat it as a blanket warrant for Congress to decide every kind of question. Again, filaments in your light bulb, gallons in your toilet, what kind of coolant there will be in your refrigerator. These things now are decided in D.C., but they weren't supposed to be.
Now, moving away from the Constitution for just a moment, what do you make of the historical analyses of left-wing revisionists such as Howard Zinn? How much truth is there to his analysis of early American history?
Do you have some aspect of it in mind?
I was thinking, I know that his forte is more or less the Columbus era.
Uh-huh. Well, Howard Zinn was, of course, a Marxist who said that the whole history of the whole world was about class oppression, and one attribute of this, or one guise in which one could find this in history, was racial oppression, but everything was about oppression. And so, in general, people who had property should have less of it, governments that had power should have more of it, and you could justify this on the ground that where this hadn't been true, people had been oppressed, and some people had more wealth than others. You can tell I don't think very much of this. He always went from people have been mistreated to therefore we need more government, as if he had missed the 20th century, right? So people who were doing that oppressing of Indians in the 19th century weren't familiar with the 20th century. And I'm always flummoxed by people whose conclusion from the history of the 20th century is therefore we need more government. Mao, Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, we need more government. I don't, and Roosevelt,
even in his
Castro.
Even in his own era of expertise, it was the government which was oppressing the Native Americans.
Right. So clearly what you need is more government. It should be a government with different people in control, but government is a good thing, and so it's very popular to assign these Zinn books. And in fact, I'm now professor at Western Connecticut State in Danbury, Connecticut, but previously I was at John Jay College in Manhattan, and so I know that in the CUNY system, which has several campuses, it's very common to assign first semester college students Zinn's book, People's History of the United States. Well, clearly, then, the whole goal of this quote-unquote education is just to tell people, the United States is terrible, every place else, by implication, is better, whites have been horrible, men have been horrible, and so what? So we need more government. You know, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, they just didn't do it right, but we're going to do it right the next time. So you should trust us. Just trust us.
Professor Gutzman, I just want to thank you so much tremendously, how much we've tremendously enjoyed this conversation. My last question to you is, especially in the field of your expertise, is how is it that the Lockean spirit of liberty, of 76, that was rooted in liberty, individualism, and anti-statism, could be replaced only 10 years later with the monarchical sentiments and the centralizing features of the government that was allowed by the Constitution?
Well, I want to push back at that. I don't think we can, well, I'm not one who thinks the Constitution was divinely inspired. In fact, I am part of efforts to amend the Constitution. I think it as people who wrote it expected, imperfections have become evident over time. But I don't accept your tacit premise that the reason we have the kind of government we have now is the Constitution. The reason we have the kind of government we have now is the people we are. That is, it's the judges, it's the executives, it's the worship of, you know, Obama, Bush, whomever. If people are going to accept being treated this way, that's what they're going to get. It doesn't matter what you say in the Constitution. The Constitution requires a particular ethos and a particular culture, and that's not the kind of culture we've turned out to have. Now, of course, the relationship between the culture and the Constitution is reciprocal. So the Constitution over time does affect the culture, yes. I mean, it's certainly been true in my own day that the judges in particular act against our traditional culture. You can see the Congress, and in the current election cycle, the presidential candidates saying, well, we want to act against the culture more. We'd like to, for example, we'd like unlimited immigration of people who are instantly going to be more likely to go on welfare and go to prison and vote socialist than the native population of the United States. Well, but the Constitution does include mechanisms for its own amendment. So if people want to use them, they can use them. I would say then the United States has been part of the great wave that swept society in the 20th century that involved changing governments so that essentially strong men, the executive, the central government had more authority, and this is lamentable.
Now, before we wrap up here, I just wanted to ask one last question tailing off of James's. Now, given that the American colonists did fight a government smaller than the one that was later permitted by the Constitution, why did they not revolt again years later after, say, Adams signed into the law the Alien and Sedition Act, or even in the next presidency when Jefferson placed the nation under martial law?
Well, I think it's possible they would have revolted if the Alien and Sedition Acts had not ceased to be enforced after the election of 1800. In fact, it's known to scholars that the governor of Virginia, James Monroe, intended to use the Virginia militia to march on Washington and force the inauguration of Thomas Jefferson if Congress had thwarted what he'd like to think was the will of the people. So it's just not clear what would have happened. Essentially, at the next presidential election, John Adams was voted out. And Jefferson saw this as a vindication, of course, of his constitutional views. He referred to the election of 1800 as the Revolution of 1800. He said the Revolution of 1800 was as real a revolution in the principles of our government as that of 76 was in its form. So there was, in other words, Jefferson believed, still the animus of the American Revolution in Americans. Now, on the other hand, it's true that people decided as the 1780s wore on that they wanted a stronger central government, and the reason for that was their experience of the Articles of Confederation, which, as they stood in 1787, had proven inadequate. Now, I said before, I did not think that necessarily meant that they couldn't have been salvaged by amendment. They didn't necessarily have to be replaced with an entirely new structure, and that's a different story. So I guess I'm resisting your conclusion. And I don't necessarily think that people had changed their minds. You didn't have to have a completely different take on these questions to think that there should be a federal government. It should be able to do the few things it was supposed to do, and that the Articles of Confederation didn't meet that description.
I want to thank you again for joining us tonight, Kevin. I think that this was a really unique and intuitive conversation about our country's history, and I'm glad that you were able to come on and share your expertise with us.
Well, you're welcome. You're welcome. I was glad to do it.
Now, where can our followers go online to keep up with your material and find out what you're working on next?
Well, I have a website. It's kevingutzman.com. That's KEVINGUTZMAN.com. You can also hit me up on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. Check me out there. Also, one other thing is I'm a faculty member at libertyclassroom.com. You mentioned Tom Woods. He and I were involved in starting libertyclassroom.com. It's the place where you can go to get the history and economics education you didn't get in school. So if you think that you've been misled in school, never fear. For a really sterling price, you can find lectures, reading suggestions, opportunities for interactive Q&A sessions online, forums where you can post questions at any time to ask of professors who at libertyclassroom.com teach courses on American constitutional history, Western Civ from its beginnings to the present, American history from its beginnings to the present, and coming soon, just between you and me, I say this, coming soon there's going to be a course on libertyclassroom.com about Thomas Jefferson. I won't say who's going to be teaching that, but you might guess.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Make sure you guys go check out his website, kevingutzman.com. Make sure you follow him on social media and check out libertyclassroom.com if you would like to learn a more accurate history of the United States as he presented us with tonight. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to the Liberty Hangout podcast. Make sure you tune into the podcast again next week at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Make sure you subscribe to the Liberty Hangout podcast now on iTunes and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Like us on Facebook. Follow on Twitter at Liberty Hangout, and make sure you check out libertyhangout.org to read some awesome Liberty-minded material from a great lineup of writers. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we will see you again next week.